Please, Marcus, stop! You're hurting me! The sound of flesh meeting flesh echoed through the concrete parking garage as Sarah's head snapped to the side, her cheek burning from the impact. Her ex-husband's hand was already raised for another strike, his face twisted with the kind of rage she remembered all too well from their marriage. You think you can just walk away from me, after everything I've done for you? Marcus's voice was a venomous hiss as he backed her against a concrete pillar. You're nothing without me, Sarah. Nothing! Sarah pressed herself against the cold concrete, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. The parking garage of her office building had always felt safe before, well lit with security cameras. But at 9 p.m. it was empty, and Marcus had been waiting by her car like a predator stalking its prey. I told you, Marcus, we're divorced. It's over. You need to leave me alone. Her voice trembled despite her efforts to sound strong. She'd been free of him for 8 months now. 8 blessed months of peace. But somehow he always found a way back into her life, like a virus she couldn't shake. Marcus grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging in so hard she gasped. Over? We'll never be over. You belong to me, you pathetic. I suggest you remove your hands from the lady. Now. The voice that cut through the garage was smooth as silk, but carried an undertone of steel that made both Sarah and Marcus freeze. Sarah's eyes darted over Marcus's shoulder to see a man emerging from the shadows between the parked cars. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, his expensive Italian suit immaculate despite the late hour. Even in the fluorescent lighting of the garage, she could see he was devastatingly handsome. Tall, with dark hair perfectly styled, and piercing green eyes that seemed to see everything. Marcus spun around, still gripping Sarah's wrist. Mind your own business, pal. This is between me and my wife. Ex-wife, Sarah corrected quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. The stranger's eyes flicked to her, and for a moment something passed between them. A spark of recognition, though Sarah was certain she'd never seen him before. She would have remembered a man like this. There was something dangerous about him, something that made her pulse quicken for entirely different reasons than fear. I don't repeat myself, the man said, taking another step closer. The threat in his voice was unmistakable now. Let her go! Marcus puffed up his chest, trying to look intimidating. At 6 feet tall, he was used to being the biggest man in the room. But this stranger had at least 2 inches on him, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from real power, not the borrowed authority Marcus wielded as a mid-level insurance manager. Who the hell do you think you are? Marcus snarled. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Someone you really don't want to cross. This is your last warning. Something in that smile made Marcus's grip on Sarah loosen slightly. She took the opportunity to twist away from him, stumbling slightly as she put distance between herself and her ex-husband. The stranger immediately positioned himself between them, a human shield in an expensive suit. Sarah, get behind me, he said quietly, not taking his eyes off Marcus. The fact that he knew her name should have alarmed her, but instead it sent a strange thrill through her. Who was this man? And why did she feel safer with a complete stranger than she had in months? Marcus was getting more agitated, his face red with anger and embarrassment. Sarah, you get back here right now. I'm not done talking to you. He lunged forward, trying to get around the stranger, but found his path blocked by an arm that might as well have been made of steel. Touch her again, the man said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper, and die. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Those 4 words were spoken with such casual certainty that she didn't doubt for a second that this man could and would follow through on the threat. Marcus must have heard it too, because he actually took a step back. You're insane, Marcus said, but his voice had lost some of its bravado. Sarah, this isn't over. You can't hide behind your boyfriend forever. He's not, Sarah started to say, but the stranger cut her off with a slight gesture of his hand. Actually, he said, his voice returning to that smooth, cultured tone, I'd be very careful about making threats you can't keep, Marcus Brennan of 412 Oak Street. You wouldn't want your employer at Midwest Insurance to learn about your extracurricular activities, or your probation officer. Marcus went white. How do you... I know everything about you, Marcus, including the restraining order Sarah filed that you've been violating. I also know about the gambling debts you've been hiding from your current girlfriend, and the fact that you've been skimming from the petty cash at work. The stranger smiled again, and this time it was even more terrifying in its pleasantness. Shall I continue? Sarah stared at the man in shock. How could he possibly know all of that? She didn't even know about the gambling or the skimming, though it didn't surprise her. Marcus had always been weak and dishonest. Marcus looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting between Sarah and the stranger. This isn't over, he repeated, but the fight had gone out of him. He backed away toward the garage exit, pointing a shaking finger at Sarah. You think you're so smart, but you have no idea who you're getting mixed up with. With that parting shot, he turned and practically ran for the exit. Sarah sagged against the concrete pillar, her knees suddenly weak with relief. It wasn't until she heard the screech of tires from the street level that she realized she was alone with a man who was possibly more dangerous than her ex-husband. She turned to face him, suddenly aware of how isolated they were in the empty garage. Thank you, she said carefully, but I should probably go now. He studied her for a long moment, those green eyes seeming to catalog every detail of her appearance. Sarah was acutely aware that she must look terrible, her blonde hair disheveled, her cheek probably already showing a bruise, her work clothes wrinkled from Marcus's rough handling. You're hurt, he said finally, and his voice had gentled considerably. Let me take a look at that. Before she could protest, he was standing in front of her, one hand gently tilting her chin so he could examine her cheek. His touch was surprisingly tender for hands that had just threatened violence. Up close, Sarah could see that his eyes weren't just green. They were the color of emeralds, with flecks of gold around the pupils. He smelled amazing, too, like expensive cologne and something uniquely masculine. It's not too bad, he murmured, his thumb barely brushing the spot where Marcus had hit her. But you should put some ice on it when you get home. Sarah found herself leaning into his touch before she caught herself. What was wrong with her? She'd just escaped one dangerous man. She shouldn't be attracted to another one. But there was something about this stranger that drew her like a moth to flame. I don't even know your name, she whispered. Dante, he said. Dante Romano. Sarah felt a little shock of recognition at the name, though she couldn't place where she'd heard it before. Romano? It sounded familiar, like something she'd read in the newspaper or heard on the news. I'm Sarah, she said unnecessarily, since he obviously already knew that. Sarah Mitchell, 28 years old, works as a graphic designer for Crawford Marketing. Divorced 8 months ago. He said it matter-of-factly, not boasting about his knowledge, but making it clear that he knew far more about her than she did about him. How do you know all that? She asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Dante stepped back, giving her space, but not moving far enough away that she felt unprotected. I make it my business to know things about people who interest me. And I interest you? The words slipped out before she could stop them, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. His smile this time was entirely different from the dangerous one he'd shown Marcus. This smile was warm, almost intimate, and it made her stomach flutter with butterflies. Very much, he said simply. Sarah knew she should be alarmed. Everything about this situation screamed danger. The way he'd appeared out of nowhere, his obvious threat of violence, his unsettling knowledge about both her and Marcus. But instead of fear, she felt an electric attraction that she hadn't experienced in years. Maybe ever. I should go home, she said, but she made no move toward her car. You should, he agreed, but he didn't move either. Will you be safe there? Does Marcus have a key? Sarah shook her head. I moved after the divorce. He doesn't know where I live. She paused, then added with a wry smile, though I'm guessing you do. I do, he admitted without shame. The apartment on Maple Street. Nice place. Good security. She should ask him how he knew, should demand answers about who he was, and why he'd been in the garage at exactly the right moment to save her. Instead, she found herself asking, "Will I see you again?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibilities. Dante's eyes darkened, and for a moment Sarah thought he might reach for her again. Instead, he pulled a business card from his jacket pocket and handed it to her. "When you're ready," he said simply. Sarah looked down at the card. It was heavy, expensive paper, with just his name and a phone number embossed in black ink. No company name, no title, nothing to give away what he did for a living. "What if I'm never ready?" she asked, looking back up at him. His smile was confident, almost predatory. "You will be." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing between the parked cars as silently as he'd appeared. Sarah stood there for several minutes, clutching the business card and trying to process what had just happened. Her life had been turned upside down in the span of 20 minutes, and she had a feeling it was never going to be the same again. The drive home passed in a blur. Sarah's hands shook as she unlocked her apartment door, and it wasn't until she was safely inside with all the locks engaged that she allowed herself to fall apart. She slid down the door to sit on the floor, finally letting the tears come. She cried for the fear Marcus still inspired in her, for the humiliation of being found in such a vulnerable position, and for the confusing mix of terror and attraction she felt toward her mysterious rescuer. When the tears finally stopped, she dragged herself to the bathroom to assess the damage. Her cheek was swollen and already turning purple. It would be impossible to hide at work tomorrow, which meant awkward questions and pitying looks from her coworkers. She pressed a bag of frozen peas to her face and tried to figure out what to do next. She should call the police and report that Marcus had violated the restraining order. She should probably also report the mysterious way Dante Romano had known so much about both of them. But even as she reached for her phone, she hesitated. What would she tell them? That a stranger had saved her from her abusive ex-husband and then disappeared into the night like some kind of dark guardian angel? That he'd somehow known intimate details about Marcus's life that even she hadn't known? That just thinking about him made her heart race and her skin flush with heat? Instead, she found herself pulling his business card out of her purse and staring at it. The paper was so thick it was almost like cardstock, and his name seemed to pulse on the expensive surface. Before she could lose her nerve, she grabbed her laptop and did a Google search for Dante Romano. What she found made her blood run cold. Dante Romano, 34, was the head of one of the most powerful crime families on the East Coast. His photograph smiled back at her from dozens of news articles about organized crime, federal investigations, and mysterious disappearances of people who had crossed his family. The FBI suspected him of everything from money laundering to murder, but he'd never been convicted of anything more serious than a parking ticket. Sarah slammed the laptop shut, her hands shaking. She'd been rescued by a Mafia boss. A real, actual Mafia boss who could probably have her killed with a phone call. The rational part of her brain was screaming at her to throw away his business card and pretend the whole thing had never happened. But the irrational part, the part that couldn't stop thinking about his gentle touch and those devastating green eyes, whispered that he'd saved her. Whatever else he might be, whatever crimes he might have committed, he'd stepped in when she needed help, and he'd protected her. She picked up the business card again, running her thumb over the embossed letters of his name. 3 days passed before Marcus tried to contact her again. Sarah had almost convinced herself that Dante's threat had been enough to scare him off permanently when she found a dozen red roses outside her apartment door, with a note that made her blood run cold. "I'm sorry, baby. Let me make it up to you. I'll be waiting at Luigi's at 8 p.m. If you don't show, I'll come find you." Luigi's was the Italian restaurant where Marcus had proposed to her 3 years ago. The roses were the same type he'd given her on their wedding day. Everything about the gesture was designed to manipulate her emotions and make her remember the good times they'd shared before his true nature had revealed itself. Sarah stared at the note until the words blurred together. She knew Marcus well enough to know this wasn't really an invitation. It was a command. If she didn't show up at Luigi's, he would make good on his threat to come find her. And next time, there might not be a mysterious savior lurking in the shadows. Her hands were shaking as she pulled out her phone and dialed the number on Dante's business card. It rang once before his familiar voice answered. "I was wondering when you'd call." "He wants to meet me at a restaurant tonight," Sarah said without preamble. "He says if I don't show up, he'll come find me." There was a pause, and when Dante spoke again, his voice had gone deadly cold. "Text me the address. Don't go inside. Wait in your car until I get there. Dante, I don't want anyone to get hurt. The only person who's going to get hurt tonight is Marcus, and only if he forces my hand. Trust me, Sarah." The line went dead, leaving Sarah staring at her. Phone. Trust him? She barely knew him. But what choice did she have? She couldn't keep living in fear of Marcus forever, and the police had been less than helpful when she'd tried to get them to enforce the restraining order before. At 7:45 p.m., Sarah sat in her car across the street from Luigi's, watching the entrance with her heart in her throat. She'd dressed carefully, not too nice, because she didn't want Marcus to think she was trying to impress him, but not too casual either because that would just make him angry. It was exhausting, trying to manage his moods even when they were divorced. At exactly 8 p.m., she saw Marcus's familiar figure approaching the restaurant entrance. He looked around, clearly expecting to see her, and his face darkened when he realized she wasn't there. He pulled out his phone, and a moment later, Sarah's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She didn't answer. Marcus tried calling 3 more times before giving up and going inside the restaurant. Sarah could picture him sitting at a table, getting more and more agitated as the minutes ticked by. Part of her almost felt sorry for him. He was clearly spiraling, and his obsession with her was destroying what was left of his life. But then she remembered the feel of his hand across her face, and the terror in his eyes when he'd cornered her in the parking garage, and her sympathy evaporated. At 8:20, a sleek black sedan pulled up in front of Luigi's, and Sarah's breath caught as she watched Dante emerge from the back seat. Even from across the street, he commanded attention. His suit was perfectly tailored, his movements confident and purposeful. He said something to the driver before walking into the restaurant. Sarah gripped her steering wheel and waited. 10 minutes later, the restaurant door burst open, and Marcus stumbled out looking like he'd seen a ghost. His face was white, and he kept looking over his shoulder as he hurried to his car. His hands shook so badly it took him 3 tries to get his key in the ignition. Dante appeared in the doorway, watching Marcus's hasty retreat with obvious satisfaction. He pulled out his phone and made a brief call, then walked over to Sarah's car. She rolled down her window, her heart hammering. "What did you say to him?" "I explained that his behavior toward you was unacceptable and would have consequences if it continued," Dante said calmly. "What kind of consequences?" His smile was sharp. The kind that would make it very difficult for him to bother anyone ever again. Sarah shivered, but not entirely from fear. There was something darkly appealing about having someone willing to protect her so thoroughly. Marcus had spent years making her feel helpless and afraid, but Dante made her feel powerful just by association. "Is it over?" she asked. "It's over," he said with absolute certainty. They stood there looking at each other through the car window, and Sarah felt that same electric pull she'd experienced in the parking garage. This man was dangerous. She knew that now more than ever. But he was dangerous in her defense, and that made all the difference. "Would you like to have dinner?" he asked. Somewhere other than Luigi's, obviously. Sarah knew she should say no, should thank him politely, and go home to her safe, boring life, should pretend that she wasn't desperately attracted to a man who probably had blood on his hands. Instead, she heard herself saying, yes. The restaurant Dante chose was nothing like Luigi's. It was intimate and elegant, the kind of place Sarah had only read about in magazines. The maitre d' greeted Dante by name and led them to a private table in the back, where they could talk without being overheard. "You do this often?" Sarah asked as she settled into her chair. "Rescue damsels in distress?" "No," Dante said simply. "You're the first." "Why me?" He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the candlelight. "I've been watching you for a while," he admitted finally. Sarah's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Watching me?" "My company owns the building where you work. I was there for a meeting about 6 months ago when I saw you in the lobby. You were laughing at something your coworker said, and he shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since. So you had me investigated? I had to know if you were available, he said without apology. I don't pursue married women. But you didn't approach me then. You were still healing from your divorce, and my lifestyle. He gestured vaguely. It's not for everyone. I wanted to give you time to figure out what you wanted. Sarah set down her fork and really looked at him. And what do I want? You tell me. The question hung between them, loaded with possibility. Sarah thought about her life. Her quiet apartment, her stable job, her small circle of friends who all thought she should start dating again. It was a good life, a safe life, but it was also empty in ways she was only just beginning to acknowledge. I want to feel alive again, she said finally. I want to stop being afraid of my own shadow. I want to remember what it's like to be desired by a man who isn't trying to control or diminish me. Dante's eyes darkened. I can give you that. Can you? Or would you just be controlling me in a different way? It was a fair question, and they both knew it. Men like Dante Romano were used to getting what they wanted, by whatever means necessary. The idea of an equal partnership probably didn't exist in his world. But his answer surprised her. I don't want to control you, Sarah. I want to protect you, spoil you, worship you. But I would never try to cage you. I've seen what happens when beautiful things are trapped. They wither and die. Something in his voice made her believe him. Maybe it was wishful thinking, but she sensed a loneliness in him that matched her own. For all his power and wealth, Dante Romano was just as isolated as she was. This is crazy, she murmured. Probably, he agreed. Are you going to run? Sarah looked around the elegant restaurant, at the man across from her who had already turned her life upside down, at the future spreading out before her full of unknown dangers and possibilities. No, she said finally. I'm not going to run. His smile lit up his entire face. Good. Because I have a confession to make. Oh God, what now? I may have bought your apartment building last week. Sarah stared at him in shock. You what? Your lease was coming up for renewal, and your landlord was planning to raise your rent by 40%. I made him an offer he couldn't refuse. Dante's expression was carefully neutral, but she could see the hint of uncertainty in his eyes, as if he wasn't sure how she'd react. You bought an entire building to keep my rent from going up? Among other reasons. Sarah didn't know whether to laugh or be alarmed. What other reasons? Better security. Marcus won't be able to get anywhere near you now. And, his voice dropped to an intimate murmur, it means I know you'll be staying in the city. It was possessive and high-handed, and probably a dozen other things she should object to. But it was also incredibly romantic in a dark, twisted way that she was apparently more susceptible to than she'd ever imagined. You're insane, she said, but she was smiling. Probably, he agreed again. Is it working? Sarah laughed, a real laugh for the first time in longer than she could remember. Unfortunately, yes. The next few weeks passed in a blur of flowers, expensive dinners, and stolen moments that left Sarah feeling like she was living in a dream. Dante courted her with old-fashioned intensity, sending her roses at work, taking her to Broadway shows, surprising her with little gifts that showed he was paying attention to everything she said. But he never pushed for more than she was ready to give. Their goodnight kisses left her wanting more, but he always pulled away before things went too far, always made sure she was safely inside her apartment before he left. It was driving her crazy in the best possible way. Sarah's co-workers noticed the change in her immediately. The bruise on her face had faded, but more than that, she carried herself differently. She smiled more, laughed easier, and had started wearing clothes that actually flattered her figure, instead of hiding it. Who is he? Her friend Jessica demanded over lunch one day. And don't tell me there's no one, because you're practically glowing. His name is Dante, Sarah said carefully. He's in business. What kind of business? Sarah took a sip of her coffee to buy time. She couldn't exactly tell Jessica that she was dating a mafia boss. Import Ashus export. It wasn't technically a lie. From what she'd been able to gather, Dante's legitimate businesses did include several import companies. She just didn't ask too many questions about what they imported or where it came from. Is it serious? Jessica pressed. I don't know, Sarah admitted. Maybe. Probably. It's complicated. That was the understatement of the century. Dating Dante meant accepting that there would always be parts of his life she couldn't know about. Bodyguards in expensive suits who followed at a discreet distance, and phone calls he had to take in another room. It meant wondering if the man she was falling in love with had ever killed anyone, and realizing that she might not care if he had. It should have terrified her. Instead, it was oddly liberating. 3 weeks after their first dinner, Dante took her to his penthouse apartment for the first time. Sarah had expected opulence, but the reality still took her breath away. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning view of the city skyline, and every piece of furniture looked like it belonged in a museum. It's beautiful, she said, walking over to the windows, but it doesn't really feel like you. What do you mean? Sarah gestured around the immaculate space. It's perfect, but it's cold. Like a hotel room. Dante joined her at the window, standing close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. I've never really thought of it as home, he admitted. It's just a place to sleep. Where is home for you? He turned to look at her, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. I'm starting to think it might be wherever you are. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Sarah turned to face him fully, her heart hammering in her chest. This was the moment she'd been both anticipating and dreading, the moment when they stopped pretending this was just a casual relationship and acknowledged what was really happening between them. Dante, she whispered. I know, he said quietly. I know this is moving fast, and I know I'm not the kind of man you plan to fall for. But I'm in love with you, Sarah. Completely, irrevocably in love with you. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. I love you too, she said, the words tumbling out before she could second-guess them. I love you, and it scares the hell out of me. Why? Because I don't know how to love someone like you. I don't know the rules or the boundaries or how to protect myself if this goes wrong. Dante cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had started to fall. There are no rules with us, he said fiercely. And you don't need to protect yourself from me. I would die before I let anyone hurt you, including myself. And then he was kissing her, and all of Sarah's fears melted away under the heat of his mouth. This wasn't the careful, controlled kisses he'd been giving her for weeks. This was desperate and claiming, and full of all the wanting they'd both been holding back. Sarah kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands fisting in his shirt, as she pulled him closer. She could taste the wine they'd had with dinner, could smell his cologne mixed with something that was uniquely him. When he lifted her up and carried her toward the bedroom, she didn't protest. Are you sure? He asked as he set her down beside his massive bed. In answer, Sarah reached up and began unbuttoning his shirt. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear. From anticipation, from desire, from the knowledge that after tonight, there would be no going back. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, she said. The next morning, Sarah woke up in Dante's arms, feeling like a completely different person. The woman who had cowered in that parking garage a month ago seemed like a stranger. This woman, the one currently tracing lazy patterns on her lover's chest, was confident and desired, and fiercely protected. Good morning, Dante murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Good morning. Sarah propped herself up on her elbow to look at him. His dark hair was tousled from sleep, and there was a softness in his eyes that she suspected few people ever got to see. No regrets? None, he said immediately. You? None, she echoed, and meant it. They lay there in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun rise over the city. Sarah knew that eventually they would have to talk about the future, about what it meant to be in love with a man whose business dealings existed in the shadows. But for now, it was enough to simply be here, in this moment, wrapped in his arms and feeling completely safe. "Sarah," Dante said eventually, his voice unusually hesitant. "There's something I need to tell you. About Marcus." Sarah tensed. "What about him?" "He's gone. Left the city yesterday. My people made it clear that returning would be inadvisable." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Part of her felt relieved. She would never have to see Marcus again, never have to look over her shoulder, wondering if he was there. But another part of her wondered what exactly inadvisable meant in Dante's world. "Should I ask what your people said to him?" "Probably not," Dante said honestly. Sarah nodded. She was learning that there were some aspects of Dante's life that were better left unexamined. Not because she was afraid of the truth, but because some truths carried a weight she wasn't sure she was ready for. "Thank you," she said finally, "for protecting me, for making me feel safe." "Always," he promised, and she believed him. 6 months later, Sarah stood in front of the mirror in Dante's bedroom, their bedroom now, putting the finishing touches on her makeup. Tonight was important. Dante was introducing her to his family as his official girlfriend, which in his world was tantamount to an engagement announcement. She'd moved into the penthouse 3 months ago, despite her friend's dire warnings about moving too fast, but it had felt right, and Sarah was learning to trust her instincts again. Dante had been nothing but loving and respectful, even going so far as to have a section of his closet converted into a studio space where she could work on her freelance design projects. "You look beautiful," Dante said from the doorway, and Sarah caught his eye in the mirror. He was wearing a perfectly tailored black suit that made him look dangerous and elegant in equal measure. "I'm nervous," she admitted, turning to face him. "They'll love you," he assured her, crossing the room to take her hands. How could they not? The Romano family dinner was held at Dante's mother's house, a sprawling estate outside the city that somehow managed to feel both grand and welcoming. Sarah was immediately enveloped in the warm chaos of a large Italian family, cousins and aunts and uncles, who all wanted to meet Dante's girlfriend and determine whether she was good enough for their golden boy. His mother, Elena, was a tiny woman with steel in her spine and laugh lines around her eyes. She embraced Sarah like a long-lost daughter and immediately began plotting their wedding, despite Dante's protests that they weren't engaged yet. "Yet," Elena repeated meaningfully, giving her son a look that clearly said she expected him to remedy that situation soon. Watching Dante with his family showed Sarah yet another side of him. Here, he wasn't the feared Mafia boss or the smooth businessman. He was just a son and brother and cousin who helped his elderly aunt to her seat and patiently listened to his youngest niece chatter about her school play. "You fit," his sister Maria observed, finding Sarah alone on the terrace after dinner. "I wasn't sure you would. Dante's lifestyle isn't easy on relationships, but you fit." "I love him," Sarah said simply. "I can see that. And more importantly, I can see how much he loves you. He's different with you, lighter, happier. More like the man he used to be before." She trailed off. "Before what?" Maria gave her a long look, clearly debating how much to say. "Before our father was killed and Dante had to take over the family business when he was barely 25. He's carried a lot of weight on his shoulders for a long time. But with you, he smiles again." The drive back to the city was quiet, both of them lost in thought. Sarah kept replaying the evening in her mind, the warmth of his family, the way they'd accepted her without question, the casual mentions of "when you two get married" that had sent her heart racing. "What are you thinking about?" Dante asked as they pulled into the parking garage of their building. "Your mother asked me what kind of flowers I wanted our wedding," Sarah said with a laugh. "And what did you tell her?" "That we're not engaged." "Yet," Dante said, echoing his mother's words with a smile that made Sarah's stomach flutter. They rode the elevator up to the penthouse in charged silence. the air between them crackling with possibility. Sarah had been waiting for Dante to propose for weeks now, ever since he'd casually mentioned looking at rings. But she was learning that he did everything in his own time, in his own way. What she wasn't expecting was to find their living room filled with white roses and candles, creating a romantic wonderland in the space that had once felt so cold and impersonal. "Dante," she breathed, turning to find him down on one knee behind her, a ring box in his hands. "Sarah Mitchell," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You saved me in that parking garage just as much as I saved you. You brought light into my darkness, warmth into my cold world, and love into a heart I thought was too damaged to feel it. Will you marry me?" The ring was perfect, a classic solitaire that caught the candlelight and threw it back in brilliant sparks. But Sarah barely saw it through her tears. "Yes," she whispered, and then louder, "Yes! Of course yes!" Dante slipped the ring onto her finger with shaking hands, then stood and swept her into his arms, spinning her around as she laughed and cried at the same time. "I love you," he said against her lips. "I love you so much it sometimes scares me." "Good," Sarah said, framing his face with her hands. "Because you're stuck with me now. Promise?" "Promise." 1 year later, Sarah Romano stood at the altar of the small church where Dante's parents had been married, watching her husband-to-be wait for her at the other end of the aisle. He looked devastatingly handsome in his black tuxedo, his eyes bright with love and promise. The past year had brought challenges, learning to navigate the complexities of being engaged to a man whose business dealings couldn't always stand up to scrutiny, dealing with the whispers and speculation that followed them wherever they went, accepting that there would always be bodyguards and security measures, and parts of his world she couldn't fully understand. But it had also brought joy beyond anything she'd ever imagined. Dante loved her with an intensity that sometimes took her breath away. He protected her, cherished her, supported her dreams, and made her feel like the most precious thing in his world. As she walked down the aisle toward him, Sarah thought about the woman she'd been a year ago. Scared, beaten down, hiding in the shadows of her own life. That woman never could have imagined this moment, this happiness, this absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. Dante's eyes never left hers as she approached, and when she finally reached him, he took her hands with a smile that was just for her. "Ready?" he murmured. "Ready?" she confirmed. The ceremony was beautiful, intimate, and perfect. When Dante kissed her at the end, her husband now, officially and completely, Sarah felt like her heart might burst with happiness. Later, at the reception, as they swayed together on the dance floor surrounded by friends and family, Dante whispered in her ear, "No regrets." Sarah looked around at the faces of all the people who loved them, at the life they were building together, at the future stretching out before them full of possibility and promise. "None," she said, echoing the words they'd spoken that first morning in his bed. "Not a single one." "Good," Dante said, spinning her around as the music swelled. "Because you're stuck with me forever now. Promise? Promise." As the song ended and their guests erupted in applause, Sarah Romano kissed her husband and knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The scared woman in the parking garage was gone forever, replaced by someone strong and loved and complete. And if sometimes she caught glimpses of the darkness that lurked at the edges of Dante's world, if sometimes she wondered about the things he shielded her from, she found that she could live with the mystery. Because some love stories didn't follow conventional rules, and some guardian angels came wrapped in expensive suits with dangerous smiles. Hers had found her in her darkest moment and shown her how bright life could be. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, because I am trying to prove to my mom that I can actually do this. It would mean the world to me. I love you all. Have a nice day.